Now, typically I don't start a watch review talking about the packaging, but I gotta say I love how classy, restrained, easy to store and elegant this is. Sorry Steve, and spoilers alert, they absolutely knocked it out the park. But of course, no watch is perfect. It's not without its negatives, because this is a real hands-on independent review. So let's get into it.
When you get out to that track, you sit down in that car, whatever it is that's roiling around your head, it just goes right out the window.
Okay, hi guys, and welcome to the show. I'll do a very quick wristwatch check wearing the Navi, still in a honeymoon phase, on the Wrist Candy Watch Club waffle strap. Typically wear this with the Panerai, but of course it's on the Navi today. Anyway, this is a premiere of a new watch. I believe the first review of it on YouTube, so I'm very, very excited. Let's get into it. As always, some context for those maybe unfamiliar with this NYC-based watchmaker. Started in 2017, Lorier is a portmanteau of the owners' names, a husband and wife team who have been at the forefront of the microbrand segment of the industry ever since their debut. As a massive Brian Ferry fan, at first I thought it was named after one of his more underrated albums. But in keeping with many of their most successful watches, it actually refers to the Pan-Hellenic religious sanctuary of ancient Greece, where the Olympic Games were first held every 4 years throughout classical antiquity. A fitting name for such a classically styled racing chrono. More on that later. Talking of classicism, to even the untrained eyes of the horologically lacking, it screams 1960s. This decade was, for watches, just as much of a fascinating and formative time as it was for motorsports. The glossy shine and post-war confidence of the 1950s exuberance that had given birth to the bedrock of the majority of the most iconic watches of all time had given way to an era that would refine them. This was, of course, before things got a little bit crazy and avant-garde in the post-quartz crisis 1970s and 80s.
Dies ist Porsche. Von Anfang an war Autorennen ein grundsätzlicher Teil der Konzeption des Porsche.
Simultaneously in Europe, we saw the birth of many definitive racing cars, like the Porsche 911, Ferrari Dino, and many others. And Formula One itself increased the displacement limit from 1.5 litres to 3, heralding the beginning of what is considered by many to be the golden age of motor racing. But the biggest changes came over the pond stateside, with the rise of pony and muscle cars, as well as the formation of many prestigious motor racing traditions, institutions, and racetracks across the USA. This all proliferated into pop culture, assisted greatly by two of the biggest stars of the silver screen, and of course kings of style, Paul Newman and Steve McQueen. These chaps were both massive racing enthusiasts, and even competed professionally, Newman especially into his 80s. So I'm going to add all the measurements, materials and all of that stuff on screen for the sake of brevity. But what I really want to focus on is that height. They've managed to get it down to only 11.7, which is incredibly impressive considering the movement. It is the notoriously tall NE88 inside, And I believe they actually worked with Seiko to reduce the height, because of course it is an automatic, so you got the extra height of the rotor. Most astonishing of all, it's only a millimeter taller than their previous manual wind Gemini. I don't know how they did it, because trust me, I've overseen the design of many chronographs, and I know how tricky it is. So inside we have a column wheel vertical clutch actuated, and this gives it that immediate, if I just stop it now, it's not clunky, it doesn't jump. Just watch it, there's no jump. It's just really fluid, and that's what you're paying for. So this movement was actually designed to rival the 7750, but in that fantastic Compax V-shape layout, which I absolutely love. Now, it was first introduced quite recently in 2014 as a 45-hour power reserve and a nice high 28,800 VPH. If you unscrew the crown, you get a nice manual wind as well, and it is indeed hackable. So yeah, pretty much the Kipper's knickers there. I believe this is regulated to about plus 12, minus 5, which is much better than the factory standard, which is, I think, almost double that. On the bracelet, we have that signature Laurier tapering that I've always loved. So very comfortable indeed. But generally, the scale gives a very period correct feel. 50 meters water resistance, typical of a chronograph, because of course you have more points of entry. The case back is left bare, and you can pay a little bit extra and have it inscribed. Really nice touch. Not many brands do that, so it's a nice little extra.
We meet in an hour of change and challenge, in a decade of hope and fear, in an age of both knowledge and ignorance. The greater our knowledge increases, the greater our ignorance unfolds.
The 1960s was an era of immense global upheaval and counter-cultural revolution, dominated by geopolitical conflict, assassinations, a space race, and the ever-looming threat of nuclear war. So is it any wonder that the tendency, stylistically at least, when it came to watches, was not to reinvent the wheel or desperately grasp at any straw possible, like the backs against the wall post-quartz crisis of the tumultuous and more daring 1970s, but to improve things carefully, with consideration and a more focused manner. On a deeper psychological level, perhaps the result of Cold War-induced psychosis. Regardless, the Olympia, like all Laurier designs, prioritizes elegance over the doctrine of instrumentation and encapsulates elements of three key historical iconic racing references of that age, then all infused with the now very established Laurier design language. The raised bezel platform that sits on top of the main body, like the pedestal of a column, is straight from the 1966 Universal Geneve Evil Nina, reference 885-10302, as is the high contrast black on white main Panda dial configuration. However, then we get pops of cherry red that firmly nods in the direction of a late Rolex Cosmograph Daytona reference 6241, aka the Paul Newman.
This is, to many, the holy grail. It's something that started an entire movement.
For decades, actor Paul Newman wore this Rolex Cosmograph Daytona. He took up auto racing while filming the 1969 film Winning. The Rolex Cosmograph Daytona wasn't a bestseller when it debuted in 1963, but worn on the wrist of Paul Newman, it became the epitome of cool.
The Olympia italic font is a really nice touch, so evocative of the Ford Thunderbird Americana of the late 50s and early 60s. The completely brushed finish of the bracelet with the solid end links secured by screw pins also evokes major Rolex vibes, as does the white painted hands of the sub-dials and the Hesselite tachymeter insert. However, the piston head pushers, minimal seconds hand, and applied markers take inspiration from the 1966 Heuer Carrera reference 2447. The diminutive Superluminova BGW9 layout is also right out of the Carrera handbook. with double plots at the 12 for orientation in low light. While on the subject of Heuer, interestingly, the playful baby blue and ruby red of the minute register reminds me of Tag's recent Skipper segmentation. So I actually borrowed one, thanks to authorized dealer Moyer Fine Jewelers, to demonstrate just how carefully considered small uses of color can be extremely effective in elevating a monochromatic design. But surprisingly, the majority of details, I have to say, are distinctly Lorier. The Dauphine handset are as much classic Lorier as they are evocative of the 1950s, and they very much complement the branding. It would have been too obvious to go stick or pencil or simply baton style here. The long beveled lugs, hefty screw-down signed crown, wide rectangular center links of the bracelets are all classic Lorier. Now lastly, the light blue of the subdial cleverly echoes the outer seconds scale, punctuated by minutes printed in numerals at the very periphery, along with a red triangle at the 12 o'clock for precise zeroing of the main chronograph hand. It's devilish little details like this that not only separate it from the trilogy of 60s icons it pulls from, but also helps to reinforce its own identity. Well, the first negative, and if I pull in the Heuer, horological Freudian slip there, the Skipper there, look at the pushers, they're very undersized. Now, on the Navi timer, which I happen to be wearing, it works with this design. It's kind of in keeping with the original design, but the proportions, I think, are a little bit small, especially when you look at like Daytonas and the ancestors of this tag here. It's a bit like the hands on a T-Rex. If you, no offense Hugo, but if you look at it too long, it does seem a little bit small. Like the T-Rex, it doesn't diminish the iconic nature of that particular beast. Another big negative, and unfortunately it still retains the ghost position or ghost date position. Again, I speak from experience, having designed several chronographs from various brands. It's a problem in this price bracket. If you're ordering in bulk, the movement, Seiko aren't going to do it. You're going to have to hire a watchmaker. That's going to bump up the price, over the $1,000 mark. God knows how much it's going to cost to modify the movement, etc, etc. But they decided this was still better than the Sellita, which would have tripled the price for virtually the same performance, and let's be honest, a lower reliability. The Seikos are absolute tanks. But then if you're paying $3,000 instead of $1,000, you're competing with the GOAT, the greatest of all time, the likes of Hanhart 417ES, which is in my opinion the greatest chronograph ever created from a very prestigious heritage German-made brand. So it's David and Goliath. I think it makes more sense going with this movement. It's just a shame that Seiko don't make a manual wind movement, or imagine taking the rotor off this. Again, this would have dramatically increased the price. I'm not sure about the well, I guess if it's an automatic you can have a screw down crown, but I'm not sure how I feel about that. Anyway guys, let me know what you think. Little push button clasp with the 3 micro adjustments, not exactly cutting edge. There's no driving race suit extension or anything like that. Now lastly, the neo vintage trend does feel a bit more played out these days, especially with the rise of the, as I've discussed in a recent review, the retro futurist trend we see permeating into a lot of brands. And lastly, the use of plexiglass will always be a bone of contention with half the audience who demand sapphire. It gives it that very much vintage feel. God, in this world of the overly entitled, quick to offend, delicate sensibilities of the keyboard watchmakers who are simply too lazy to use the polywatch, which is actually included. I like how Lorier stick to their guns on this. Lorier remain master mixologists, blending neo with vintage with just as much talent as DJ Shadow sampling vinyl to create introducing. The results are always something that doesn't feel overly forced for the sake of capturing a kind of faux nostalgia, like Tarantino's shallow riffing of Lady Snowblood for his largely forgettable movie Kill Bill, for example. But to continue this cinematic metaphor, it's more subtle and seamless, like his best work, Jackie Brown or Pulp Fiction. There's a reason I repeat view those movies every few years. It has a verisimilitude and a coolness to the way it captures the essence of 1960s and 70s cinema, just like how Laurier do so in their creations. And this is very much what separates them from just another neo-vintage homage brand, in my opinion, or the danger of being too self-indulgent, like the car-laden Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, which I actually really do love.
All the shooting. I love that stuff, you know, the killing.
A lot of killing.
Anybody order fried sauerkraut?
But anyway, back to the watches. This takes skill, true passion and a deep appreciation of the subject material to homage in the truest sense, not in the contemporary definition that has been very much corrupted by endless AliExpress cash grabs. Some watches you just connect with instantly, and I distinctly remember how I felt when I first saw this. Its period-correct size and understated individualistic design elements, while still managing to give me that Paul Newman feel, is just the kind of thing that would typically empty my wallet. However, I've already had my own short-lived Newman phase, satiated by the Tudor Tiger, briefly, and then for many years the Dan Henry 1962. Both of these dalliances left my personal collection, but if I was to ever go back to itch that scratch, this would undoubtedly be my first choice. Ultimately, while it does not have the Capo Lavoro status like the very first Neptune, that out of the gate put Laurier at the crest of a new wave of neo-vintage Tempesta back in 2017, it is, however, a far better watch and design than the Gemini it replaces, which I've got to be honest, I wasn't a massive fan of. It's a solid watch, and while it certainly continues the continuity of the brand, it lacks that inexplicable spark of magic that this more nuanced Olympia certainly has. So there we have it, guys. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, especially what they got right, got wrong in your opinion. Also, nominations for the best automatic chronograph under $1,000. Please do share that. Obviously, I always say this, but it really does help. If you want to support the channel and want to see more free and independent content like this, don't forget to hit like. And if you haven't subscribed, please do. I'll catch you in the next one. Onwards and upwards. Thank you for watching. Ciao.